Now, the Singapore Biennale is set to return later this year for its 7th edition. This time, it's been given a name called Natasha. The Biennale looks to shed its perception as a mega-thematic exhibition and focus instead on how art is connected to people and lives. For more, my colleague Luk Wei Su is speaking to June Yap, co-artistic director of the Singapore Biennale 2022.
Oh, Ms. Yap, it's called Natasha. Why?
Thank you for having me today. So for this 7th edition of the Singapore Biennale, organized by the Singapore Art Museum and commissioned by the National Arts Council, the Biennale itself is known as a format of curated exhibition and often distinguished by a thematic title. But for the 2022 Biennale, however, we've decided to take a different route and give it a name. Now, naming itself is quite a unique act in its performance and its outcome. When something is named, a change of relation occurs. With naming, the named becomes perceived differently. It becomes familiar and may even take on certain shape. So the name we've given the Biennale is Natasha, and this is a name that is actually familiar to many around the world as a human name. And you might imagine then that the Biennale takes human form. This ability to invoke is very interesting for us, but not just in the human form that might come to mind. Instead, it is also about its opposite, the non-human, the invisible, and even the cosmic. So a simple example of this phenomena would be that the naming of natural forces, like hurricanes, for example, to distinguish them from each other. Or perhaps how we interact with technology.
Pardon me for cutting in. If I could cut in right here, Ms. Yap. Just as an example, this is in Singapore,
Sure.
right? So Natasha may not be a name many Singaporeans would be quite so familiar with. So you say we name hurricanes and typhoons to distinguish them from each other. So why Natasha? Why not, I don't know, Siu Ling, for example?
Exactly. So for us, what's interesting is the act of naming itself and what naming does. And how in naming, the Biennale undergoes a subtle but a distinct shift. And the name Natasha itself, for us, is not specific. It could have been another name, but Natasha is the name we landed on. Within the region, I think for ourselves, we actually do know a few Natashas ourselves. So we thought that it is familiar enough for us. And in relation to that shift then, that's quite subtle, for us, the naming allows for us to think about or sense a certain presence, a presence that will then connect us to the life in art and beyond art.
Okay, in fact, my colleague Jill was mentioning this is a greater focus this year on how art is connected to people and lives. Now, art is always connected to people and lives simply because when we look at art, we can only understand it because of how we see it and therefore how we interpret it. Do you see our 2 years of dealing with a pandemic locally and globally, has that in any way made us more or less attuned to art in terms of how we interpret, how we approach art? And does this Biennale reflect that in any way?
Absolutely. For us, the planning of the Natasha began actually during the pandemic. So it's been challenging because my co-artistic directors, Ala Yunis, Vida Ghost, Vina Choi, with myself, and like many others around the world, have had to meet online instead of in person. So there is this sense of a disconnect. And obviously, the effects of the pandemic has also given us a heightened sense of our existence. So these things have fed into our thought processes in considering the art and the experiences as art that we hope to bring to the public later this year. And this would be in a coming together and an encounter of each other's presence and perhaps a lingering also with each other and with the art for a period of time. This includes conversations we wish to have with artists, not just with public, about how we might look at the world around us in a slightly different light.
All right. you would want to do something different every year, including what you've just mentioned. Now, how does that translate into how this year's Biennale is going to, well, the Biennale is 2 years, how it will be carried out that, from your point of view, will be very different from how you have done this in the past? Final answer.
So, as I mentioned, in the convention of biennales, one looks at perhaps some kind of themes. But for us, this presence that Natasha kind of invokes allows us to look at a few aspects of life and art in a way that is perhaps more closely tied. And you're right that art itself is experienced through our life experiences. But here we want to bring more attention and increased attention on this subjective experience, not only from an artist's perspective, but also the artists themselves, the artists behind the works. And for us to think through and connect even more deeply during this time.
Well, thanks so much for all that. June Yap, Co-Artistic Director of the Singapore Biennale 2022.